Our next event is happening in Singapore between the 27th and 28th of February 2025. Now, Founders Longevity Forum Singapore is a unique event brought to you by Founders Forum, the Academy for Healthy Longevity at the National University of Singapore, and of course, Longevity.Technology. Now, this event brings together global leaders, clinicians, academics, and primarily for us investors to increase knowledge around the sector and to drive growth. Now, longevity investment is one of our two main tracks at the conference. 500 Global is a VC firm with 2.3 billion AUM, investing in founders all around the world who are building fast growth technology companies. And the company focuses on global markets where innovative capital meets ecosystems, and it can propel these startups to unlock long-term value. And I can think of no better place than Singapore for that. So joining us today is the managing partner of 500 Global, Vishal Harnal. Vishal, how are you?
Lovely to meet you, Phil. I'm doing very well. It's good to see you over here. Thanks for having me.
Oh, great! And we're pumped about coming out to Singapore because really we see this whole area, whether it's longevity as a vertical or Asia Pac as a region, of course, blowing up. So, how would you say that APAC and longevity and healthspan sectors are accelerating across the area, and how are you getting involved as 500 Global in this space?
So, a little bit of background. I live in Singapore, but I live between Singapore, Tokyo, and the Bay Area. I've been shuttling between these ecosystems for about a decade now. And even before I was a venture capitalist, in a prior career when I was a lawyer, I know you're going to ask me a little bit about that later. I was always interested in the space of longevity and health span, more as an amateur and terrible biohacker. I know you remember the whole longevity forum groups that used to be there, where everyone is sharing their N of one experiments on themselves, to now much more in looking at it in a much more institutional capacity. But it took a while to get there. I think that was true for other parts of the world, and it's definitely true for APAC. So I've seen it develop, and there's a renewed interest now in the spaces of health span and longevity. And I think that there are a few factors that have been driving it in APAC. If I were to summarize it, the two things that I think have been most important are first, an understanding from the ground up from consumers who care a lot more about their health. And that has changed because wealth levels have changed and the status goods of what it means to be wealthy has changed. And people prioritize their health a lot more than they did. It's almost like the new Veblen good, right? It's the new version of a handbag is how well you're taking care of yourself. How well do you look on the inside and the outside as well? So that's a change from the consumer up. And obviously it shows itself first in wealthier individuals and then trickles downwards. So in Asia, where you have a fast growing middle class segment, and in more advanced economies like Japan and South Korea and Singapore and Taiwan, already wealthy individuals, it just permeates slowly and trickles through the entire ecosystem. Now that's from the ground up. Now, from top down, I think there's been an increased conversation at the government level for the most developed economies in APAC about healthcare of their population. So if you think about countries like Singapore, the largest drag on GDP is always going to be healthcare and maintaining an increasingly aging population. Phil, you're the expert at this, so you probably know this better than anyone, that the largest populations of aging individuals are in Asia, right? If you think about that from a numbers perspective and from a percentage perspective, the top places like Japan, South Korea, Hong Kong, Singapore, which are wealthy countries, have a huge and increasing number of their percentage of their population moving into that category. So it becomes part of I've seen the word slip in as part of government level conversations, health
Yeah.
authorities, right? Health regulators. So I think that's been a fundamental shift in APAC in the space of longevity and healthcare.
Yeah, and of course, Vishal, you're very focused on building companies. You've done that very successfully as a fund already. Now, with Founders Longevity Forum being in Singapore, and obviously we talked about our focus on healthspan, what would you say is the benefit for the Asia Pac region for longevity-focused startups that may differ from counterparts in other regions? Is it that imperative from the population perspective, or do you see other parts in the ecosystem that will help these companies?
I think first that it is an imperative from a public health perspective And not just from a public health perspective, also from an economic resilience perspective. As citizenry gets older and their healthcare and they live longer and the healthcare needs and the healthcare costs keep ballooning, keep focusing on health span ensures, a longer period of economic productivity, a longer period of a happy population as well, and less cost from a nation's perspective, from a national perspective. So I think that that's one drive. But the other drive is people prioritizing health, right? And so I think the needs of each individual population in all of these markets are quite unified, right? A person in a similar socioeconomic situation in Singapore is no different from a person in a similar socioeconomic situation in San Francisco, in London, in Paris, right? In Tokyo, in any of these other big cities. And so they care about largely the same things. We divide the world into regions and countries, but really at the cities level and at the socioeconomic level, when you draw parallels between people from different parts of the world, they end up being a lot more similar than we think, especially in their needs, wants, desires, and their health outcomes now that they want in life. Now, where I think that there's an interesting opportunity in APAC is that the cadre of, for example, in the biotech space or in the pharma space, or even in this entire the health span entrepreneur space, there's a very large cadre of postdocs turned entrepreneurs in markets like the US, especially in Boston and in some European countries. But that's very nascent over here. So you've got first grade research institutes, first class universities, right? Like the National University of Singapore, which I know you're also affiliated with, at Todai in Tokyo, and various other places in Asia. But the percentage of postdocs that are willing to take a risk and spin out or commercialize the research and turn it into a therapy that's focused on health span or lifespan, or for that matter, any other area, is low but slowly increasing. So things that would otherwise remain locked up in the vaults of the university or licensed out to other entrepreneurs in other markets, I think that there's an opportunity to build in Asia. So I think that's one part of the conversation. The second part of the conversation is that regardless of whatever is available nationally, there's some opportunity in healthcare and longevity that governments would want under sovereign control. And you would want local players and local champions, especially when it touches on healthcare, which is becoming an increasingly important subject, as we just discussed. Mm-hmm. So an increased focus on the nation state, and I think an increased underscoring of sovereignty and the importance of healthcare citizenry and sovereignty creates opportunities for entrepreneurs to build. And what it could mean is that, using your 10 levels of longevity, if I were to use that as an example, for things like clinical services, you don't need to optimize for the global maxima. You don't need the best in class worldwide to provide those clinical services. You can have a local maxima, a local champion, or many local or regional champions also building similar businesses, products, services within those markets.
And of course, you mentioned the 10 levels of longevity. So thanks for bringing that up, Vishal. It's one of my serious missions this year. So obviously, the 10 levels addresses all the different complexities around biotech and non-biotech companies in the space. So what would you say are some of the most exciting innovations that you've encountered in longevity and health span in your field as either active investments you've participated in or things you've seen in the marketplace?
When I started on this journey 10 plus years ago, and it was a personal journey for me because it happened first was my own interest, and then my mom, who's the healthiest person in my family, had a heart attack while we were all just sitting around the table at my parents' house having lunch. And that got me really focused on this idea of your genetic destiny being different from your lived reality, and trying to explore what happens in that intersection of health span, longevity, and how do you overcome what you would just take as being the normal course and progression of aging. And that's really what got me interested in that time. And it was mostly from an angel perspective, because even from the funds perspective and an investment perspective from our institution, there was not enough of an ecosystem that existed, right? So everything was fascinating to me at that time in the space. When you don't know what you're looking at, everything looks like magic and amazing. Then over time, as you dig in and get more familiar with the ecosystem, you develop a more sophisticated understanding of what people are building, what is really a business opportunity, and what is just science for the sake of science. So if I'm sitting in 2025 now with my glasses on, my biggest interests are in the intersections of spaces, of intersections of technologies and intersections of discipline. And I would be remiss if I did not say that AI X longevity and health span is probably one of the category defining areas that is of great interest to me, whether it is in drug discovery. I know you must be familiar with the news of In Silico and what they've done so far,
Yep,
which is fascinating, right? And that's like a
indeed.
US Hong Kong kind of like they've got a presence, a foot in both Asia and the US. So generative AI powered medicine, I think, is also a huge area that I find very interesting. And that's on perhaps on the technology side. The second thing that I find fascinating is perhaps maybe insofar as the body is concerned, is that there's a lot of focus on health span and lifespan as it concerns our physicality. But I also care a lot about cognitive decline, right? Cognitive decline and perhaps consciousness. So I think that there's a lot of momentum and drive in building therapies even in that front, because
Mhm.
there's no point having a long life with an extremely healthy body if your mind can't keep up with the rest of it and what is happening. So I think, traditionally there's been a lot of investment into spaces like Alzheimer's and preventing perhaps mental illness from that perspective. But what's happening now with new technologies like AI and with new money being put into getting the bodies to stay longer is an increased focus and new ways of looking at mental health and mental resilience over the course of our lives. So perhaps those are the two areas that interest me the most. But if I
Yeah,
would
well,
pick,
of course, in many respects, Vishal, it is exponential. I mean, we're seeing now some very exciting interventions between biotech and AI beyond just the traditional drug discovery process. But obviously, you as an investor have got great experience backing unicorns globally. So, what are the key factors that you look for when you're evaluating early stage startups, specifically in the health span space? When you're looking at the sector that we're at, you're a very seasoned investor. What are you looking for?
so I'm a generalist. I like many different categories. I've got my pet areas, and within 500, I'm probably known as a crazy person investing in new things that no one's touching, right? Like things that are on the frontier, space, like cellular engineering, whatever it is. I'm usually the one that's doing investments in those categories because I love founders that think big. But that also comes with a lot of risk, right? And I think one of the lessons I've learned over the decade of investing is especially when it comes to areas of healthcare, is that you really truly need to understand who's going to pay and when for the product that is developed and delivered. And I think for healthspan, that's one of the very interesting questions, because on the consumer side, there's definitely an increased willingness on the consumer focused healthcare, right? Which is one of the topics on the forum that we'll be speaking about later. But you start to go up the chain and you're talking about therapies that are perhaps more expensive, when you're thinking about whether preventative healthcare and health span lifespan is something that governments and insurers are willing to underwrite, and how they're going to do that underwriting and whether that would fall under what is treated. And most importantly, the timeline under which that change is going to happen. I think that's an important lens to have in the health span space. There's this adage in venture that you must be familiar with, which is being early is the same as being wrong. And so it can be a great company, but just a little bit ahead of its time because of something like an unwillingness to pay or no product market fit because of that sort of like the issue. I think that would be one of the pitfalls that I look for when I'm looking at health span startups.
Great. Well, I mean, and when we meet in Singapore, I'll tell you about some of the things that I see as really the next generational step of where we're going, because I feel that the industry is stabilizing now, which is great. And
Yeah.
that means that it's solid and people can see it as an investment category. But of course, there's another horizon that we're all starting to look at now. So we'll talk about that when we're together on stage in Singapore. But Vishal, let's talk a little bit about your background as a litigator before you entered the venture capital marketplace. How did that legal expertise influence your approach to investing, and particularly, I guess, in highly regulated sectors like biotech and healthcare?
So I've embarrassingly had three careers. I was an entrepreneur. I built a company when I was doing my military service in Singapore right after high school. I did that through high school and law school. It was in the education space. Then I moved on to become a lawyer. That company was definitely before its time, the one that I tried to build. And I was a litigator for an arbitration lawyer for 5 years. Now, what was interesting about the person under who I practiced law and the area that we focused on, they were your largest, most global, international commercial cases. And they were kind of bet the company cases, bet the company, bet the person. You're putting it all in, and if you lose it, the consequences are devastating. And because of that nature of what we were practicing, that area of law, and the fact that you're usually at your last resort when you're coming to us for resolving a dispute, we took more risk than other people would, because we're trying to come up with the best solutions that are commercial for the client, that involve thinking about the law and the frameworks that you have in innovative ways to create a solution. So a very large part of that was not just first class lawyering, but it was also adding creativity and being able to think about the game that you're playing from different angles and perspectives. Like, how could you win the case before it even reached court or arbitration? And that is how it informed my perspective on investing, which is, can I think about my investment in the companies from a different lens and different perspective, and work with the founders to craft a different way in which they can win at a market, win at a strategy, close a customer, do something else that is meaningful in de-risking the company and allowing them to die another day, right? Or hopefully make it big. And I enjoyed that very much. Now, from a regulatory perspective, what it's given me is a deeper understanding in how conservative you need to be on how regulation changes. I think one of the things I noticed in the startup ecosystem in general is a belief that you can build first, let it be in this gray/black area, and perhaps regulation will change over time and come to terms, right? We saw this a lot with ride hailing, for example, but that didn't, or even e-scooter sharing and companies like that. But that doesn't necessarily happen because regulators work usually on their own time horizons, especially in more conservative markets in Asia. And so if you want to change something, you can't take a passive role in it, nor can you take an antagonistic role in it. You've got to work with the regulators early from day one, understand how to navigate that ecosystem, and then change it that way. I think that's very apropos for things like healthspan and lifespan, which are things that you want to put on the national health agenda. Healthspan especially, lifespan is less of an area of interest for me. And working with regulators, understanding the vernacular and process that they use towards getting something across the line, and really helping them be winners in the space is one of my takeaways from that time.
So, Vishal, you're going to be joining us at Founders Longevity Forum in Singapore. Can you give us a flavor of what you'll be talking to us about?
I'm talking about a topic pretty close to my heart, which is on the consumer longevity market. It's fascinating to me because of, number one, the amount of excitement that is around this area. Number two, that it is so accessible to so many different people. And I get the most questions from all of my friends and family and people around me about this particular category. So I'm excited to speak more about it and learn from the other fellow panelists and yourself, Phil, at the forum. So very excited to learn about that.
Yeah, great. Well, it's going to be a whole morning session of that. So, Vishal, we very much look forward to seeing you in a few weeks' time. We'll see you then.
Excited to be there, and thank you again, Phil, for having me.